So we have a relatively small group today, so we can keep this really, really interactive.
Right.
One of the things when Pimo asked me to talk is, well, what do you want me to talk about? And she said anything. And so when I was looking at the program, it seemed like a lot of the things were about the process of venture, about the process, how does it work, what do you do, how do you get a deal done, how do you do these different things. So I thought I would take a slightly different tack and talk a little bit about how you look at one aspect of venture. And so venture capital at heart, there's a lot of different things you look at, but when you evaluate any given investment, at the highest level, it kind of breaks down into 4 buckets. One is markets, what's the market look like, what are the market forces there? One's what's the team, how strong an entrepreneur do you think this is? How is this somebody you want to give money to? Where are the gaps? How do they fill them? How strong is the product and technology, and what's the financing? And so at the highest level, evaluating any venture opportunity breaks into those pieces. So what I thought we'd do today is take a look at markets a little bit and a case study, kind of work in progress, around a market force that I think is occurring around this concept of connecting the world. So mobile, big data, social, cloud, yeah. So those were my big 4, cloud, social, mobile, and big data. Those are very much, right, the big forces that we're kind of seeing in this landscape that have really triggered a whole new tech revolution broadly across the entire landscape. Then there's a couple of other ones that sometimes come up. Open source is really, a big trend in terms of the use of open source and open source as a business model. And another one that's kind of coupled to social, kind of coupled to open source is this idea of consumerization and democratization. And these are sort of big forces at play, right? This is what everybody in one aspect or another is investing around behind, maybe how they come together, maybe in any given vertical of these. So at the highest level, I think those are the big trends. Those were exactly the 4 we came up with here. I don't think there's anything terribly insightful about that, but I think it's worth sort of thinking about what's at play. So just a little bit more on some of those. So cloud, apparently we couldn't even walk upright before we got to cloud computing. According to IDC, this is the most disruptive sort of change in technology infrastructure in the last 20 years. And whether we could walk upright before cloud or not, certainly, Amazon, if you talk about the startup environment, Amazon is a huge force in terms of changing the dynamics of that landscape in just a couple of quick charts showing the growth of their two of their big dominant products. So big data, you guys probably know, we tend to talk about it as big, right, in terms of the volume. It ties also to the variety and the velocity, so the speed is really going up. And so if you look at this chart, you look at sort of what we've always felt like we dealt with a lot of data, right? Information technology was about databases and data application and digital exhaust, right? This is a term you hear all the time, which is I'm going to capture the information about a click, a stroke, an eyeball. I have no idea why it's useful, but it might be useful later, so I might as well store it because it's so cheap. One of the things that's really critical here in big data is the cost of the infrastructure changed so fundamentally that I can store anything that I'm not even sure that it's useful because later it might be useful, right? When I analyze it and I look at all the different correlations, it might actually be the critical thing, so I'll store it anyway. And so that's a radical reduction in cost. Social, I think, from the discussions, descriptions of people, I think a lot of people have focused on social. But if you look at the time it has taken for different technologies to get to 50 million subscribers, the big red triangle is cable TV. So it took 13 years to get to 50 million subscribers.
Wow.
In contrast, and I think everybody in the room intuitively knows that, commercial, and if you're talking about commercial, it's very much faster. But if you look at Facebook and Twitter, as you look at these new social technologies really coming into adoption, Twitter had 50 million subscribers in 9 months. So very fundamentally different time scale for adoption and different cost structure too, right? If you think about how much money cable TV spent promoting itself before it got to 50 million subscribers. So, what do those 3 trends together mean? Well, it certainly means there's lots of opportunity around social opportunities, around cloud infrastructure, around big data analytics, around all these different things. So there are lots of different investment theses going after each of those. But from an entrepreneur's perspective, it's never been cheaper and easier to start a company, to store and analyze data, and to drive adoption. These are just new things that you can do because AWS makes it, or any of the cloud service providers, makes it so cheap and easy to turn up and host some kind of software-based company, to get a bunch of data and look at it, and to drive adoption of that service. It's just, as an entrepreneur, it's really easy to do that. We didn't, I didn't show any of the open source data, but open source is a big piece of that too. It used to be that innovation happened within big companies like IBM and Oracle and Cisco, and they kept all the technology to themselves because it was the basis of competition. But now we live in an era where Google and Facebook and Yahoo and all these different companies are actually leading technology innovation. People pretty much live and breathe based on these things. And if you talk to young, I think this was US, I don't know, I think this was US youth, and you asked them to rank order different services. They had Facebook connection and they had internet connection above housing, above. So the pyramid of needs is very different now, and so compute is always available. In place and time have become increasingly important. So real time and location have become important behind mobile. You have a ubiquitous network because if you have all these mobile subscribers walking around, it's not very useful if they're not online. The expectation is there that they're online. And then the other thing people don't tend to think a lot about is there's a lot of sensors in this phone. I mean, I have an iPhone, but any smartphone has a lot of sensors in it. They all have cameras. They have light sensors, they have location, they have GPS lat long, they have accelerometers, they have probably a bunch of stuff. So there's all these sensors walking around that is starting to change the world. So as I was thinking about this, it seems like you can kind of go through stages of how web and mobile has evolved. And at the very first sort of, and this is very loose, so this is only meant to be sort of conceptual. At the beginning, it was really about exploring and organizing information. So if you think about Yahoo and Netscape, it was about exploration and about organizing information. And then with Google, we had personalization around ads and content that you could search. Then it became about connecting with people, and so social was a critical driver. And now increasingly, it's becoming about connecting with places. If you think about geo as service, and so maps, local. So I have example here, Google Maps and Street View. But local is a big piece now of what's happening. And so to me, we're having this shift from the virtual world to the real world. So that's kind of esoteric, I think. It's kind of abstract. So I was going to do some examples. And again, ask questions as we go. Certainly, as I said, this is kind of evolving thinking. But if you so I think of maps as the framework for organizing information about geo, about that location. So it's the backbone of physical world information. So we're at DLA Piper, right by the Four Seasons. So I have a map of this location, and this is sort of kind of the first generation of maps. Classic view maybe is that you had kind of the street information. Then we moved into getting satellite perspective on these so that we had granularity around texture and what does that house look like, what does that building look like. Now you can almost zoom in and drive down to write the location. You can actually see the DLA Piper writing on the side of that wall. And so these maps are becoming increasingly sophisticated. And these are all, I think these were all Google Maps, but everybody has different versions of these. So they've become increasingly sophisticated. In terms of where this might go, is you use the mapping infrastructure as an application mashup, right? You mash up application data against it. The Foursquare founder had a great quote, which is, maps make him sad. They feel lonely. They're empty to him because they're just sort of a blank slate. And if you think about Harry Potter had a map, right? He had a map that showed him where all his friends were. They showed him where different, whatever content that you might want to know. And so the future, I think one of the things that we will see increasingly with maps is the content, the filling in of the content, where the map is really just a framework to organize the information. So if I want to know where all my friends are and where they're going, well, that's using the map in a social context. But I can use it to get much more granular around 3D data. I can push into the interior. If you look at these maps, I only have outdoor, but I want to know, I might want to know how people are using space. I might want to know what the mapping of an indoor retail space is. And in fact, some people are putting this up for this holiday season to help you shop more efficiently so you can get to that garment as quickly as you need. But maps, I think, are the backbone of how we organize information about space and time. So, you know, if we push on this a little bit about how we're starting to increasingly interact with space, well, real estate is one really antiquated industry that is not using information technology very deeply around its space. So if you look at democratization coming together with mapping, coming together with social, then Airbnb is this great success story of using peer-to-peer networks, you know, a peer-to-peer relationship to discover and share physical space. So now I'm starting to use, this is not highly mobile, but this is getting into the context of I can discover new content that's located to that's about physical space that I wouldn't have had access to before. And then a couple of, Airbnb everybody's heard of, but a couple of small companies I wanted to highlight. And what I'm going to do through the rest of this is highlight trends. Unfortunately, there'll be companies as a result, but I don't mean them as ads for any of the companies. And I should disclaim that the first one, this first picture up in the upper left, Honest Buildings, is a more David portfolio company. But what Honest Buildings is doing is building a network around real estate and buildings. And so it's exposing all of the information around a building to increase leasing effectiveness, to increase facility improvement, to be able to highlight all of the great, say, work they've done to update the lobby, and to help, as a result, the different contractors and service providers as part of that showcase their work to other real estate owners. So it's really a network around buildings and the data and the services around them so that they can find each other more efficiently. PlanGrid in the lower right corner is what they do is they share blueprints on tablet applications. So if you think about the construction industry and the architecture industry, my architect draws creates the plans, then we have these giant sheets of paper that go to the job site, the change order tracking, what version you're on, how you manage anything, let alone all the printing and scrolling, you know, just the issues of all those people walking around with these giant scrolls under their arm. So what they're doing is bringing that information now again about the physical world, and now you have that repository of information about buildings, and it's coupled by making the construction, the design process much more efficiently by sharing those blueprints on a tablet like any other information you might have. Another thing that's going on is in commerce. You know, commerce we think of as very much an online thing, right? When we think of the cutting edge of commerce, we think of, wow, well, Amazon really changed that, where they brought that all online, and now we have thousands of variations from Amazon at one side for mass marketplace and maybe Etsy at the other side for much more personalized. But what we're seeing is that these online retailers are increasingly coming back offline with this concept of the pop-up store. These are super popular in New York and San Francisco. I'm not sure how well penetrated they are globally. At some level, I guess a pop-up store is an old staple so I've spent a lot of time in China, and certainly pop-up stores are the way commerce is transacted in developing economies.
Excuse my ignorance, what are they?
A pop-up store is a store. It's a small, like I have a picture of one over here on the right-hand side that happens to be a vitamin water store, but it's a very small kind of kiosk that you pop up for a couple days, maybe a couple weeks, maybe a month. So it's a temporary retail space.
It's like Halloween spirit.
Halloween, so you can do it for seasonal. You can. Microsoft has a lot of pop-up stores right now trying to push Surface. So they tend to do them around products, a specific product that you want to.
So it's like a little kiosk.
It's a
in
kiosk.
A bigger store.
Or on a street. No, they're physical.
Okay,
so
got
the
it. Thank
purpose of them is to make it physical.
Got it.
If you think about Apple maybe as a, I don't know, maybe as an example, that's something that you want to take advantage of. So again, it's this sort of mixing of the offline world and sort of physical space, and how does that relate back into to something that we think of as moving increasingly online. Another thing in commerce too, again, we talk about e-commerce and online commerce, but by far the bulk of sales actually happen through physical retailers today. By far, volume is still going through physical retailers today. And if you think about physical retailers versus any online retailer, they are at a gross disadvantage. They know almost nothing about their business. If you're an online retailer, you know everybody who comes to your store. If you're advertising, you have a sense of what demographic you're advertising, how many people may have seen, how many people clicked, how many people got in line, how many people maybe abandoned shopping carts. You have all this information that a physical retailer really has no idea about. They have some sense that I'm in a good location because, overall there seems to be some level of foot traffic. And again, the phone changes all of this, because since you're all walking, or since at least 50% of US subscribers are walking around with a phone, the phone can be used to start to provide analytics about who's walking by the store. If you change your promotion, how many of those people are now coming into the store, so you can get some sense of what's happening in terms of the effectiveness of your storefront displays. Where are people spending time in the store? How many people are getting in line and then sort of maybe bouncing out of line because it's too long, it's too slow, it's ineffective. So it gives you much more information about how to stock, how to arrange, how to staff, all these things that online retailers have had these kind of analytic capabilities but have not been available offline. And so these sorts of capabilities are starting to show up about how do I manage my store? How do I know what kind of traffic is going by outside? How do I know what kind of traffic is coming in the door? And this mixing of these very online capabilities, but starting to appear again in our physical world. So continuing in sort of this sort of kind of different topics. One of the big things here, certainly in San Francisco, since taxi service is so bad, is sort of a real revolution in car services. So the top left icon there is from Uber. And what Uber is doing is it's taking spare capacity from town cars and matching them to people who might want a ride near them. And again, this is really taking advantage of location in your phone, because as a consumer, now you can say, I want a car. They know where you are, they know where you want to get to, and they know where the cars are, because the cars obviously are reporting location. And so they can do that real-time matching of cars and capacity on the car side with customer demand on the customer side. Uber is kind of car service, spare capacity, and car service. The bottom right is Sidecar, but there's a whole bunch of these companies, Sidecar, Lyft, a whole bunch of these other companies, which are basically doing peer-to-peer car services. So if you have a car, there's lots of people who have cars and have maybe some spare time, or maybe just like the social interaction of meeting new people on the street. Well, I can give you a ride, and the idea is sort of a formal, informal car sharing. But if you are part of, in this case, say the Sidecar network, then as a driver, you have an app that's mounted, and as a consumer, I can kind of type in that I want to be picked up here and go so-and-so, go somewhere else, and they have drivers that are circulating that can come get you. And now again, so I have the location capability, I have that real-time matching of location in place, and I can use social to have driver ratings and passenger ratings so that you can manage and provide an interaction around feeling some level of security around the interaction. The revenue potential on the one side of really utilizing that space, and as a city, parking collections are actually a big revenue source for them. So how do you maximize the revenue potential of the real estate space? Certainly a huge consumer problem, right? How do I find the parking space and matching those in between? And then you can get to follow-on business opportunities too, because how many times have you thought about going shopping or going to dinner, but you don't know where to park, right? So OpenTable could say, would you like parking with that? And you could have a reservation at the garage, probably not at the street, since I'm guessing cities are not quite ready for that. But really streamlining that consumer experience by understanding physical space and tying back again to this idea that consumers want to know about everything. And then in the sort of far extreme, Those of you who are local have probably seen the Google cars driving around, and so they drive themselves. And they do that by creating these very complex representations of physical space so that they can make those judgments about how to drive. But from a much more realistic perspective, if you look at companies like Ford and Volvo and GM and sort of all these mainstream cars, they actually have tons of sensors in them, right? So they can self-park. I think the BMWs are showing overhead views now, so you can kind of see when you're parking. Ford Focus, I know, self-parks, but I think BMWs are kind of showing an overhead view, so you can sort of see how your car is positioned relative to other features around you. And this is all available because they have tons of sensors in the car. And so one of the things that Ford claims is coming pretty soon is traffic jam assist. And so that they're using their existing sensors in the car to have kind of a sort of cruise control on steroids. So they have some level of location and proximity sensing that help you drive. You know, they already have lane assist and park assist and all these other things. So now they'll include traffic jam assist so that they can help help you drive on freeways. And so this is obviously great as a consumer if I don't have to pay a lot of attention to driving, and there's driver safety benefits. But one of the big benefits that actually comes from having this happen too is congestion management. Because if you can start to coordinate those cars and you can start to optimize driver responses to changes on the road, you can greatly reduce traffic. And so they're saying if 1 in 4 cars have this kind of self-driving capability, you can get a 25% reduction in overall throughput time. Just because a lot of it is from this bunching that happens with sudden accelerations and decelerations, and if you can smooth that out, then you can have tremendous benefits. So kind of a peek into the future, but the idea again that as you increasingly have sensors deployed, you can really have a lot of changes in the services that become available. Another area that's seeing a lot of interest is around health and wellness, and this kind of dovetails with a theme that's called for this greater I don't know, ethos that's called quantified self. But when there are big disruptions on power lines or in power distribution, in general, utilities actually have no idea where this happened. Utilities often don't know about a power outage until a consumer calls them and says, hey, my power's out, what are you going to do about it? And that's the way they actually, it's improving, but that's the way they actually monitor, is that if you get one call, well, who knows? I mean, that could just be one call. But if you get enough calls, then you start to know that there's something wrong, and you can start to understand what region might be impacted. But it's a pretty antiquated way to be doing business in this day and age, that you're waiting for consumers to call you that you have a problem. And so the smart grid is part of this big capability, this big ability to upgrade the grid in terms of having intelligence that starts mainly in the meter. People have talked a lot about putting, and certainly those of you who are in PG&E here have smart meters that know what you're using, that could report that there were power outages. And this idea is partly so that you can reduce demand, but also so you can bring in new renewable sources of energy with wind and solar, that you can have much more control and automation through the grid. That's pretty esoteric. So I thought it would be worth talking about an application that's maybe closer to home and maybe some of you have seen, but it's the same idea on a micro scale. So Nest is another example here of a company, and they're doing what they call a learning thermostat. The company is actually founded by Tony Fadell, who was one of the leaders behind the iPod at Apple. So it comes from this great design pedigree, which I think has led to a level of interest around this company that ties to this pedigree. But the idea is, you know, if you think about energy in your home, most people don't necessarily want to think about it very much, right? It's not sort of a top 10 thing on your list of things to do today is manage my energy. But at the end of the day, you do really want to be comfortable. And energy can be actually a pretty significant bill. So to the extent that you can reduce the cost too and optimize your comfort, that's a really good thing. So Tony's designed this really beautiful thermostat that hangs on the wall that is now programmable through your smartphone and is learning about when you know, it's a little bit like your TiVo that, you know, it knows now that you actually want it a little bit hotter now. So I have to admit, I have programmable thermostats at home, but don't program them, right? And this is a very common signature. But if you use a Nest in the same way you use a standard thermostat, which is you turn it down a little colder when when you think it's too hot and you want it to be colder, and you make it a little bit hotter when you want it to be hotter. It learns your habits, and it starts to understand when people are at home and they want it warmer, when people want it colder, what the different attributes are. And so this idea of using beautiful design, which we didn't talk about through here, but beautiful design I think is a critical element, combined with utility and increasingly interacting with physical space. So if you look at a lot of that, so I kind of did a whirlwind through some different examples of how I think kind of the online world is mixing with the offline world, that the offline is truly coming online. If you look at a lot of those examples, those are enabled largely today because people are walking around with mobile phones. Some of them involve more sensing, like the Nest thermostat involves more sensing. Certainly self-driving cars, you have to have a whole bunch of sensors in the car for the car to figure that out. But we're starting to see, I think, the beginnings. So we're starting to see the beginnings of all these applications that mix with place and time, just by the advent of the phone. Increasingly, I think we'll start to see more sensors come online, and this is definitely one of the things that's being highlighted here, is that more and more mobile subs are coming online all the time, but also more and more embedded devices, so that cars have many different sensors. Your thermostat has sensors. Your TVs will probably have some level of sensing and capability. So your fridges, you know, people have talked about your fridges. So these embedded sensors in your home, in the industrial, where a lot of these changes will show up is in the industrial zone, so that airplanes, for example, would be much more efficient. Generators would be much more efficient, and that we increasingly see this sort of advent of sensors that allow physical endpoints to come online, and that we can manage and understand those physical resources more efficiently. And so, you know, I call this talk towards a connected world, but really, to me, this is about the mixing of the offline and online worlds, and that web and mobile is increasingly penetrated into the physical world, as we see, and part of that is going to drive, I think, this deployment around sensors. One of the things that's happening there is that they're just getting so small and so cheap that they're very easy to embed. So, you know, I started this not because I don't think you guys are necessarily going to be investing around connected world or starting companies in connected world. But I sort of did this as what I thought would be kind of an interesting case study, that if you look at sort of those four big forces we talked about at the beginning, and tons of people going after investing in each of those areas, right? Big data analytics. I can do horizontal investment around infrastructure and databases. I can do data analytics platforms around real-time analysis or focus on developers. There's lots of opportunities in each of those. I can do cloud, and I can do different platform as a service, and I can do different platform portability plays. I can do different applications. But you can look at each of those trends and say, wow, there's tons of investment opportunity in each, and I think there absolutely is, and we've certainly seen that in the venture world. But you can also take a look at them and say, well, how do these things coming together start to change things, and what's the next piece that comes after that? You know, this is definitely a trend where it stacks up on the overall hierarchy of things, but I think we'll need to see how it plays out. But it's an area that I think is really interesting, so just kind of wanted to talk with you guys today.
So just before everyone asks questions, I just wanted, that was like fabulous overview of, and I've never looked at it like this, but what strikes me extremely is how disruptive to other offline businesses or local governments or whatever this is going to be. Obviously not initially, but slowly it will become, and they really have to rethink their business models because of this. Thank you so much. It's fabulous.
Well, thank you.
I've just never looked at it like that.